Today we're going to do a bit of an educational piece and really talking about what net zero means and what this kind of means for your organisation. You may have heard this term coming out of COP in the last couple of weeks, so kind of what does that actually mean for you and kind of going forward. So, Planet Mark's Zero Carbon Tour. So we've been travelling around the country in this fabulous 100% electric coach for the last 3 months. We actually started down in the Eden Project, which is one of our charity partners, back in G7 in June. And then a bit of a break over the summer, but 3 months we've been travelling around the country, and we've been working with the Government Department of Base to help raise awareness of what COP26 is. As well as the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign and the Together for Our Planet campaign. But throughout the journey, we've been gathering carbon stories, so speaking with organisations and understanding what the tangible actions that they've already started doing that is helping them to reduce their carbon within their organisation. And Jeremy, that might be a nice thing we can help as well in January of kind of gathering these stories. And we've been collecting them on this website called carboncopy.eco. And on there you can see different organisations, different sizes, different sectors, and seeing what are they doing already. Really help to inspire other people to start doing the same. And also we're helping organisations to enable them to set credible net zero targets. I think that's quite a nervousness. People say they want to do it, but they don't really know where to start. So we're helping them to set those targets and tool them up to make a plan and make actions today. So this is bit of a map of where we've been going, covered the whole country. We even had a hydrogen bus over in Northern Ireland and worked our way up to Glasgow for the COP summit the other last couple of weeks. But believe it or not, we're not actually an electric bus company, nor are we an events company, although we've learnt a lot in the last few months. But we're actually we're sustainability accreditation. So we help our members to measure their carbon footprint, understand what that baseline is, and help them to set targets and create action by enabling them to engage with their employees as well. Employees, their stakeholders, even their customers, to help them embed sustainability within their organisation and also communicate that message. So help them to ensure that there's no kind of greenwashing, but also inspire and help their client base to do the same as well. So I'm going to do a bit of an educational piece as well. So why are we talking about net zero carbon? Carbon I'm going to be using as a bit of a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalents, which is the whole of the 7 greenhouse gases, and we use that as a bit of a whole term when we talk about carbon dioxide equivalent. As you've probably heard of, obviously, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxide, and to be honest, I can't even pronounce the other ones. So there's quite a few greenhouse gases, and we're just kind of using that term carbon. Now, I don't want to kind of depress people on a Wednesday morning, but I think it is quite important to remember why we're here and the kind of the science behind climate change and actually why we need to start doing it. And you may have seen this graph before, but if you haven't, I think this is a really poignant graph of why we're here in this situation. So this graph shows over the last 400,000 years, the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has always been fluctuating. And over such long periods of time, our planet has kind of evolved and adapted to cope with these changes of levels. Then over the last 10,000 years, our atmosphere and has started to balance and neutralise out, and that has helped humanity to move away from hunter-gatherers and become farmers. That's when we started to settle, we started our agricultural farming and started to grow as a species. But it wasn't really until kind of the Industrial Revolution when we started to burn fossil fuels at the extent that we're seeing today. And as you can see in the last 70 years, this line is where it's dramatically increased in such a quick amount of time. So our atmosphere just cannot regulate. And that's why we're seeing the extreme weathers, we're seeing the kind of blanket effect of the greenhouse gases and heating our planet and causing our unpredictable weathers that we're now seeing, which is going to cause problems with our kind of agriculture and farming, as well as the melting of the ice caps, sea levels rising, acidification of the sea, and causing we're coming to our 7th mass extinction. promise I won't be too doom and gloom this whole presentation, but I think it's really important to just remember this is the situation we're in, and we're now at such a critical time, so we need to start doing urgently to reduce our carbon. So over the COP, you may have heard about this reducing our average global temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was actually coined back in COP21, which was in Paris, so you may have heard of Paris Agreement. And this is the kind of trajectory that we're on. This red line is if we stick to business as usual, this is where we're heading. And if I'm honest, catastrophic situation we're having if we're up here. So we need to start moving this line, the bottom blue line, and keeping it well below 1.5 degrees. And what's come out of COP over the last couple of weeks is at the minute we're not on that trajectory. So we really need to start making some urgent action to keep that temperature low. So why net zero? And I mean, pretty obvious, the time is absolutely now. We're at the critical stage, and the UN have coined this 10 years up to 2030 as the decade of action, and that's 2030, we've got 8 years left to really make a big difference. But there's lots of kind of sticks and carrots within this in collaboration with business. We're seeing a huge amount more of public knowledge, public awareness. Certainly out of COP, we've seen a huge amount more of media covering what we need to start doing now. And there's perfect, unsurmountable evidence from science now, and the IPCC report that was released earlier this year says it is absolutely down to human behaviour is why we're seeing the planet warming. So we're kind of seeing this environmental push, that social push of saying, come on, we need to do something, which is then helping the increase in policy. So our governments are starting to introduce more policies, and we've seen a few coming out of COP this year, saying, the large corporates now need to release an action plan of their net zero targets. But that's going to start trickling down because we need every organisation, all the SMEs, every individual to get on that target. And you may be aware of the PPN, the policy procurement note that was announced earlier this summer, and it was actioned in the 30th of September this year. So any public tender of the increase of value of over £5 million, you have to have a net zero target and an action plan. And I know that may be some relevance to some organisations here today. So we're seeing this push of policies being driven, and that will only increase over the coming years. But of course, there is a commercial imperative behind this. Obviously, I'm here to say this is important for the environment, but actually we're totally aware that this is such a business, huge amount of business benefits of really embedding sustainability, and we no longer needs to be a nice to have, or only certain kind of eco-friendly companies have this sustainable policy. Actually, everybody needs to be working on this. And so there's plenty of research out there showing the huge business benefits of starting to incorporate sustainability. And I'm sure the people in the room here are already on that journey and are seeing that benefit. But how can we do more and push it more? And certainly we're seeing kind of employees are asking now, well, what are you doing as an organisation? How are you mitigating your carbon emissions? Or what are you doing in the social remit of your company? And so if your employees as well as your clients are asking for this, then showing what you're doing is so important for businesses. But also reducing your energy consumption. I mean, I'm sure you're aware the energy prices at the minute are at an all-time high and is only set to increase. And a bit of a cheesy line, but we always say where there's carbon, there's costs. So if you're reducing your carbon emissions, you're reducing your costs, which will only help with growing profits of an organisation. But using it as a benefit to position yourself within the markets as well. Yes, we're seeing tenders are constantly asking what your sustainability message is, but you want to do more than just ticking that box for a tender. So much more than that. Positioning yourself in the market, saying this is what we're doing differently to our competitors, more so than just meeting that policy. We want people to go further. So, bit of jargon busting now. What does net zero actually mean, and other terminologies? So apologies if you're well informed, but I think it's always important to go through this in a little bit more detail as well. So your carbon footprint, I'll start there, is divided up into 3 different scopes. So your first scope, here in the middle, in fact it's quite light, sorry, it's a bit blurry, you can't quite see that. But your first scope is any fuel that you're burning as an organisation. So that's any gas or oil heating your offices, your manufacturing, your warehouses, as well as any fuel burnt within your company-owned vehicles. So that's your scopes 1. Your scopes 2 is any emissions, and energy that you're purchasing from the grid, so that's mainly within your electricity. So the scopes 1 and 2 is the energy that you have direct control over. So you can decide as an organisation how much or how little you're using. So this is the first part that you absolutely must be measuring, understanding what that is. And that's just using, you know, your energy bills, your utility bills, your any petrol receipts. That's how you can start measuring this. Now, scope 3, as you can see, is everything else, and that's incredibly complex and a difficult one to measure. But we need to start looking at all our organisations to start measuring scope 3, and you can't quite read that there, but I'll make some of them. You've got your purchasing of goods, the products that you're manufacturing, business travel, you've got employee commuting, your transportation of your goods to and from your supply chain, your entire supply chain. So how are they producing their products? How are they heating their offices, as well as the products at the end of life. What's going to happen to that afterwards? So as you can imagine, this is a very complex supply chain, but one way of looking at it is your suppliers' scopes 1 and 2 lead into your scope 3. So if you're asking your suppliers, are you measuring your scopes 1 and 2, and they say yes, makes your scope 3 a hell of a lot easier. So we kind of want to start seeing this ripple effect. If you're starting to measure now and asking and having that conversation with your suppliers, what are you doing? Then they start doing it. They then ask their suppliers and continue. And if we're all looking at it, then we can start understanding where those emissions are. And then if we look at what net zero means, so we've talked about the scopes 1, 2, and 3. So what net zero actually means, so you can't quite see the line, so that's all right. So having your scopes 1 and 2 to absolute zero. So that means all your energy that you're consuming, all the vehicles that you owned, they have to be run from 100% renewable energy. So from solar panels, from wind farms, from electrical vehicles that is being charged by renewable energy. So they have to go to absolute zero. Then your scope 3, obviously that's a very complex thing to start measuring, but we're going to start, every organisation will end up having to measure everything, and we want to bring that down to as close to zero as possible, preferably to at least 90% zero. Now there'll always be that little bit of 10% residual emissions, purely because every of your supply chain will be at a slightly different point within their journey of net zero. So if that's the case, then we can use offsetting, accredited offsets for carbon removal schemes, and I'll talk a little bit more about offsets shortly. So then that brings that down. And that's using natural solutions and as well as technology that's going to be slowly evolving of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So having those 3 steps is where you'll get to net zero. Now that sounds quite daunting, but I'll go through that in a little bit more. This is a different way of looking at it. I don't know if the lines are going to come up. There's a little bit of a green line there. But to kind of differentiate between this and carbon neutral as well. So you've probably heard of carbon neutral. I think a lot of organisations could throw that term out a little bit too liberal at the minute, but the difference really is, so the blue line here, net zero, so that's absolute, from 100%, whatever your baseline is, to absolute zero. We know that we're going to have this bit of residual emission because your supply chain's not quite up. So having your net zero here and then bringing your residual emissions down using carbon removal offsets only. Then the difference, I don't know if you can see, yeah, at the end there. So that's, sorry, I should say, this one here, it's for net zero, you want to be looking at your scopes 1, 2, and 3, and that's an absolute requirement to measure those. Now for carbon neutral, you're only looking at your scopes 1 and 2, so far easier to measure, but as long as you're measuring your scopes 1 and 2. And then using carbon removal or carbon avoidance offsets to take away everything that you've measured. So for example, if your footprint is 5,000 tonnes of CO2, you then purchase 5,000 tonnes of carbon offsetting credits, and you can claim to be net carbon neutral. Now what's really important there is carbon reduction doesn't necessarily have to be within that. And what's so key to get to this position is carbon reductions. So just be wary if you see companies saying we're carbon neutral, or if in the room you're claiming it already, that doesn't necessarily mean you're reducing your carbon, so it's not really making a difference. So offsetting is great as a step towards where we need to go, but it's not everything. We absolutely have to be focusing on carbon reduction. Then the next term you may have heard is carbon negative or climate positive. This is doing the same as your carbon neutral, but you're purchasing more, double or more offsets. So again, 5,000 tonnes CO2, you're then purchasing 10,000 or more offsets. But again, carbon reduction is not necessarily in that path line, so that's not going to get us to the place where we need to be. So that's the kind of difference between net zero and carbon neutral. Now you're all looking a little bit nervous, going, well, that's all great, but how the hell are we going to get there? Before I go to that, let's talk a little bit about carbon offsets. So there's two different types of carbon offsets. There's carbon avoidance, which you can use, which will be wind or solar panels. So that way you're avoiding any carbon that you're burning. But carbon removal is where we're starting to suck out the carbon in our atmosphere. So that's tree planting, that's peatland restoration, that's seagrass development and restoring. And that's really what's important us focusing on in the removing of the carbon in our atmosphere. But again, be wary with tree planting, for example. It takes about 10-15 years before a tree can actually start absorbing the carbon. So don't think you've planted a load of trees, happy days and all good. Again, we're talking about carbon reduction is absolutely key. And technology is evolving in that area, but we're not really anywhere close yet for that to be our kind of go-to methods. But there are, you may have seen in the news in Iceland, they've launched their first carbon sequestration technology, which is literally sucking out the carbon in the air. But at the minute, they can do 4,000 tonnes a year. And I'll be honest, probably everyone sitting in this room in their organisation probably do about 4,000 on their own in their organisation. So it's not going to get us to where we need to be, but it's the future. So how, if I can go. So your first steps and how are we going to get to net zero? So first off, you have to just know where are you starting from. So measuring your carbon footprint today, if you're not doing it already, is absolutely key, just so you know where your baseline is. This is a bit of an example of a carbon footprint report that we do for our members, and we try and make it as easy and simple to use as possible. So as you can see, everything that's been broken down, and we look at scopes 1, scopes 2, and elements of scope 3. The ones that you can get the readily available data for, and then if we're going to evolve into scope 3 mappings, which I'll talk about in a bit. So here you can just about see, with this footprint, you can see this big blue bit is natural gas, this big orange bit is electricity. So suddenly you can actually start focusing, okay, we need to focus our energy, excuse the pun, financial and strategy into looking at our gas and our electricity. You know, I think a lot of people kind of focus on recycling. Oh, we recycle, you know, we're great at recycling. That's what we're doing. That's great, don't get me wrong, continue doing that. But the waste here, I can't quite see which one, I think it's this one. It's a tiny sliver of a footprint. So we want to start looking actually what your baseline is in order to really help driving that focus on the right areas. And these are the kind of key categories that we look at during our measurement. Again, you've got your scopes 1 and 2 in there, and then these are elements of your scope 3. We've also included home office. You know, we can't ignore, the majority of us are still kind of hybrid working. We still have a bit of an impact even if we're at home. But it sits slightly outside of your total purely because it's a bit of an estimation. So we look at all these different categories within your standard kind of certification to start your organisation off somewhere. And as you can see, we do a bit of an equivalent measurement. You know, majority of us, we're not carbon literate. You know, what does 2,500 tonnes mean? Majority of us, we don't know, and that doesn't really relate to anything. But as soon as we do an equivalent measurement, that's actually 2,185 flights from London to New York. You suddenly can understand, that's what that is. Okay, now we know where we need to focus our energy. And also, this is a great way to kind of engage your staff or even your customers and really show them, be very transparent. You know, this isn't a naming and shaming exercise. This isn't how bad are we. It's we're acknowledging this is what we are, and now we're on that journey to reduce it. So the second step is setting that credible net zero target. And this is probably where most organisations get stuck and go, well, I don't know, what do we know we're going to do? So we've got a few examples. So the minimum that you need to do is setting your target by 2050. Now that's because the UK have set in law, you have to be net zero by 2050. So whether you like it or not, you're on that journey. And so that is your absolute minimum requirement. So if you see an organisation go, we're going to be net zero by 2050, well, everyone is, so all right, big deal. And that is, again, looking at your scopes 1 and 2, and to get us better, and so we know we're on target for this date, we want to be at least 50% reduced in our carbon emissions by 2030. So you've still got 8 years to get that 1 and 2 down to 0. So you're going to be doing that anyway. And then obviously working on the rest of that by 2050, and the same for your scope 3s, looking at that by 2030. Then a good option, and the majority, I'm assuming everyone here is a manufacturer, we'd kind of suggest this as a manufacturer purely because your scope 3 is a hell of a lot more complicated than, say, a law firm who aren't producing anything. So here is a good target, and I'm being a bit basic, saying 2050, 40, so 42, 48, whatever. So having your baseline at 2040, and again, you're still looking at 50% reduction by 2030, and looking at your scope 3s. Again, by at least that 90%, remember that 10% residual emissions that we'd offset. Now, to be a leader in the field, then having a net zero by 2030, a lot of organisations are claiming this, but let's make it a little bit more achievable, a little bit more useful to every organisation. So let's get our scopes 1 and 2, and we have control over those, to be absolute zero by 2030, and that will be fantastic. Now your scope 3, because your supply chain is going to be at different, they might be on a 2040 deadline, whereas you're on a 2030, so you've got to then work together. So let's see if we can get a 55% reduction by 2030, 80 by 35, 100 by 40. So that way it makes it a little bit easier. You know, you're not going from 1 to 100 within a year, it's not going to happen. But having those small steps each year is where you're going to start really feeling like you've got control over it and you can actually get there. So we're a partner of the UN-backed Race to Zero. You may have heard of this term, certainly over COP. And they're encouraging organisations to do these four steps, and I believe they've added a few more P's onto it during COP. So first, get a pledge out there. Say, if you're comfortable in saying, yep, 2040, get it out there. Tell everyone that that's what you're going to do. Then within 12 months of you pledging that, start making interim targets. So start measuring your baseline and have that plan to get to 50% reduction by 2030. But take immediate action and show that you're measuring, you're starting to make action to reduce that. Then publish publicly. That's really important. We want everyone to be communicating what they're doing. That will only help inspire and encourage other people, whether it's your clients, whether it's your competitors. Let's all push each other along to do more. So this is the campaign from the UN. You can pledge on our pledge wall here at our Planet Mark Tour website. and we can help you kind of meet those targets. So the third step, I'm making this sound so easy, aren't I? So this is you really can't see that, but it says engage and communicate. So this is the kind of 3-step process that we've developed, and we think this is kind of the best way of really getting to where you're going to be. So obviously you've got to measure, understand what your baseline is to begin with, whatever that may be. Engage, get everybody on board, whether the whole departments within your company, whether it's your stakeholders, your investors, your clients, and then your supply chain as well. Tell them what you're doing and how you want them to get on board. You'll be surprised, they're probably thinking about it too. We need to start joining everyone up and making more kind of progress. And then communicate, tell your message. Be clear of what you're doing or what you're not quite doing, or if you haven't quite achieved that target in 2024, that's okay. We've acknowledged we've missed that target, now we're doing this, but you won't be able to know that until you continually measure each year. But just keeping you on target and celebrating what your achievements are. You'll be surprised actually if you've made something happen and another organisation, doesn't even have to be in the same industry, go, oh, we can do that too. That's what we need to see. So start talking about what you're often doing. As I said, this is kind of diving into a bit more detail. Get everybody on board. Have round tables with your supply chains. Speak to them, see what they're doing. Ask them, are you measuring your scopes 1 and 2? You might think you're a small cog in a big chain, but actually if everybody starts asking those questions, then they're going to start making everyone think, oh, if I've been asked, then maybe I should do. And remember, if you're a part of a supply chain, for somebody, your client has made a net zero target, they will be asking you soon for your scopes 1 and 2. So think about it like that. We're all part of this chain. So get everybody on board and really make kind of embedding sustainability within your organisation. And finally, this is just a few graphics that we've been kind of developing and saying, look, after COP, this is a great time as a bit of a springboard. You know, we're all excited. We really don't want COP to kind of be the end. And our tour, we actually finish our tour tomorrow at our Planet Mark Awards, but it's not the end. We don't want to say, yep, okay, we've heard about what the government are doing, we'll leave it to them. No, it's up to all of us. We all have a responsibility, and we're all kind of should be acknowledging it and doing something about it. So I don't want to be lecturing you too much, but 8 years left to 2030. So is there anything that you can do today that you think you can make a change?